And with that, I want to introduce our speaker here today, Dr. David Langemo on destructive leaders in an organization. He is the founder and president of Meadow Leadership. He has a bachelor's degree in music education, a master's in organizational management, and a doctorate in business administration with a specialization in leadership. He has over 20 years experience in IT, higher education, and nonprofit leadership. He's a certified interim executive director of nonprofits and is currently writing a book about leadership from a child's perspective. He lives in South Minneapolis with his husband Drew, dog Mabel, and cat Reggie. And he is proud to be a founding member of the Minnesota Pride Rotary Club. So if you'll help me in welcoming our speaker and fellow Rotarian, Dr. David Langemo.
Thank you. And I am a teacher, like many of you, so I can't stand behind a podium. My dad's a pastor. I'm a pastor's kid, and if I am behind the podium, I feel like I should read the Bible to you. So I'm going to. Oh my gosh, those educators left. Oh, I was going to tell them two things. One of them, she talked about it. I'm writing a book. I'm interviewing children across the U.S., ages 8 to 12, 2 per state, on their opinions of leadership. What are good things leaders do? What are bad things leaders do? They've got all the answers, and that's their people right there. One of them actually played for a boy from Indiana, I think. He plays basketball. And I said, "Do you think you're a leader?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Let me tell you, if you're playing basketball, you are a leader because you're helping your fellow teammates get to a goal, right? And that's what leadership is all about right there." One of the weird things they do is, they said, I am asking them, "Who's your favorite leader?" And a 12-year-old boy from Connecticut said, "Christopher," I have to get this right. Is it Christopher Joseph? I think that's it. Does anybody know who that is? It's the captain of the Mayflower. Who chooses that as your favorite leader? And then a 9-year-old girl from Nevada said Julius Caesar. Who chooses that? Anyway, I am almost, my topic is super exciting and lots of fun to talk about, but I would have loved to hear more about the middle school sports program, so glad to have them there. As she said, my name is Dr. David Langemo. You can just call me David. And I'm here, I'm going to different Rotary clubs, and I'm just talking about my research that I did for my doctorate. That is the entire purpose for me being here. Does anybody else in higher education? So I can pick on higher education a little bit? Not so much, that's good. What I wanted to do when I was working on my doctorate is do study on love and leadership, because I believe that love can be used as a tool in leadership. The school wouldn't let me do that because love is not quantitatively measurable, right? So my specialization is leadership. I've got a doctorate in business administration, and I was just going through different leadership topics. And one of them I came upon was destructive leadership. Who's heard of this before? Not very many people. And so I did a little bit more research on this. It's been around since 1938. This is a pre-World War II term. And I still had not heard of it. And just like all the other types of leadership, authentic and servant and transformational, it's a valid leadership style. And just like the other types of leadership, the word leadership is the second word in that phrase. It's got followers in destructive leadership. So I did a lot of research on this. And before I talk anymore, let's define destructive leadership. And since I'm a teacher, I like to ask questions to all of you. Can anyone make a guess what makes a destructive leader a destructive leader? Maybe what makes them different from a bad leader?
Motivates by negativity.
Oh, motivates by negativity. Good.
Make the bottom line negative.
Pardon?
Make the bottom line of an organization in a negative.
The bottom line of the organization has a negative slant to it. Yep.
How about some emotional abuse?
Completely emotional abuse. Yes. The difference between the two is a bad leader could be somebody who's simply an inept leader. They're just not very good at what they're doing, right? A destructive leader has to have at least 3 things. They need to be, the behavior has to be systemic. It's just a part of their character. It's got to be repetitive, so not something that they do just once. And there has to be intent behind it. You are never an accidental destructive leader. Isn't this a fun topic? So what I did was I interviewed board members across the United States who volunteered to talk to me about destructive leaders in their organizations. So both coasts, down in the South, lots of board members. Pardon? I can honestly say I stayed away from DC. Nobody there wanted to volunteer. Good question. When I go out and talk, I don't talk about politics or religion or psychology. It's all just the business aspect of destructive leaders. So that's a very good point. There's a lot of research on politics and destructive leaders, but I stayed away from it. There's a lot of research on education and destructive leaders. I stayed away from that. In the interviews, I was surprised by how many board members were in tears because they're still full of trauma and fear. Surprised by how many board members regretted not reporting the illegal activity that the destructive leaders had done. So, does anybody want to share? This is a safe place, but I'm not going to force you. Anybody have any destructive leader stories? Not that you're going to share. It's tough, isn't it? I'll tell you one. I reported to a destructive leader, actually. I won't tell you which job. You can look at my LinkedIn profile and make a guess. And he repeatedly, on a regular basis, yelled at one of my coworkers. His office was next to mine, her office was across, and then there were more offices going down the hall here. And this was before I had heard of the term destructive leadership. And I did nothing. All of the other people in the offices down the hall did nothing. His behavior continued. Why? We didn't know how to intervene. We didn't know how to stop it. We didn't know who should stop it. When should we not do this? We didn't know any of those things. So then I do this research, and I took my friend out to lunch, the one who had gotten yelled at all the time, and I apologized to her. I said, I'm sorry, I just didn't know what to do. And she understood. So there are times when you just don't know what to do. Yeah.
Could be that you know sometimes, and you can't do it because it will do a personal harm to you.
Yes. Fear is a huge part of it. I for sure knew that I would be fired if I said anything. He happened to be a very tall man. I'm kind of tall, but he was inches taller than me, built like a linebacker, which is $1 million idea for those middle school teachers, right? Oh my gosh, shouldn't we all go to middle school gym classes? Wouldn't that be $1 million idea to help lose weight? Anyway, yeah.
I was just going to say that in the example you gave, which I have seen also, there's a power imbalance. So what you do, and one of the cases that I know of, the person was so disliked that the people were able to keep getting him promoted, so he would go somewhere else.
Absolutely. She was talking about a power imbalance, and the person was able to keep getting promoted, so he would go somewhere else. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, too, but that's a good point. I do have a sheet in the middle of your table and my business card if you want to look at that, but on the left-hand side in the blue box, there are some facts. And again, think of this just from a business perspective. We lose almost $24 billion annually because of destructive leaders. Annually. Which nonprofit can afford that? We can't. That's through employee turnover and productivity. Can anyone make a guess, because I'm a numbers freak, how much does it cost to replace a person if they leave your organization? Pardon? 2 times their income. I've heard anywhere from 30% of their income to twice their income, like you just said. So if you've got a person making $100,000 in your nonprofit, which there probably aren't that many, you could lose up to $200,000 just getting this person replaced and trained. It's too much money. 38% of Americans have been victims of a destructive leader, and fear is what stops us from doing anything. It's just too much. So there were 3 themes that the board members and I came up with in the bottom there. Fear and anxiety was a huge theme. Enforcing and creating written policies. There are too many organizations that just don't have policies for how to deal with a destructive leader, even if they have an HR department. And finally, the loss of productivity and employee retention. Any questions so far? Yeah.
Since I'm a research did you find that it was more significant or prevalent in nonprofits nonprofits versus corporate?
Her question was, did I find it more prevalent in nonprofits versus corporate? For this particular research, I stuck with nonprofits, including my research. It was all nonprofit based. No, not all the research. Most of the research was nonprofit. The problem is that there isn't enough research in nonprofits for doing research for like this kind. So I had to do some in the corporate world. Yeah, great question.
I guess it will be magnified in for-profit organizations, much more loss than non-profit.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So, some fun questions. And again, I'm a numbers freak, so just shout out a number if you want to. How many employees do you think in the U.S. make up the nonprofit sector? How many people work at nonprofits across the U.S.? Pardon? Can you give me a number in millions? 63 million people. No, I'm sorry, 12 million people. Now I gave you the other answer. 12 million people work at nonprofits across the U.S. 63 million people volunteer at nonprofits across the U.S. So between those two numbers, we're looking at 75 million people who could be negatively affected by destructive leaders. This one's not on there, but for the fun of it, do you know how many nonprofits are in the state of Minnesota? There's actually close to 40,000. There's 38,000 nonprofits in the state of Minnesota. It takes 3 board members to be on a board in order for a nonprofit to be a real nonprofit. So, fascinating. So we've talked a lot about destructive leaders. What are some, and you mentioned one, bullying. What are some examples of behaviors that a destructive leader might exhibit?
Taking advantage of the employee, making them more work for their work.
Taking advantage of the employee, making them do all the work.
Physical abuse.
Physical abuse.
Yeah, I mean, it's seemingly not apparent, but touching abuse to other types of physical abuse.
Yep. Yelling, out of control behavior. Public humiliation. If you think of it in terms of small t and capital T, the abuse goes from small t, such as bullying, belittling, gaslighting, manipulating, those kind of things, to capital T, harassment, pulling a gun, fist fights. I've heard all of those stories. It's astounding, isn't it? Which is why there's a lot of fear involved. Yeah. So why does this behavior continue? Why do we have destructive leaders working in these organizations? Yeah, it's so many different reasons, right? I know of a destructive leader in the Twin Cities here, and she is really good at raising money for her nonprofit. She has more innovative ideas in her pinky than I will ever have in my whole life. The most innovative person I know. But she can't keep people employed under her. They leave all the time. So she loses money with people, but she brings in so much money with how much she raises. So she's charismatic. They're going to stay because they're successful. They're charismatic. People love them. They do have followers, so the followers uphold them. They often have friends in higher up places, so it's hard to get rid of them. Can you think of anything else? There's one more reason that I can't remember right now. It'll come to me, though. Yeah.
When they have friends in high places that support them, do they know that those people are destructive? Or do they not? I mean, is it almost like these people are split personalities? So that with their followers, they're just pals and nice and everything, and they would be like, oh, I could never believe Bob or Mary would be like that.
In the interviews that I did, it was half and half. Sometimes the board members had no idea that the destructive leader was their friend, and in other times they totally knew, but they weren't going to do anything about it because they valued the friendship. Is there a pastor amongst us? Okay, in some cases, I interviewed board members of churches, and the pastor was the destructive leader. and that makes it really tough too. Although I enjoyed that because I'm a pastor's kid. So the number one thing that was missing, we found out, the solution, is an intervention. And yet that's what was not happening. People don't know how to do an intervention, whose job it is to do it, when should it be done, what are the steps. Okay. In my research, I didn't talk about how to do an intervention. I just needed to get all of their viewpoints, and then I was basically done. Since then, I've done a lot of research on how to do an intervention. So when I go out and talk to organizations, I don't just talk about destructive leadership. I can talk about all aspects of leadership. And I also do aspects of how do you do an intervention. So we did come up, though, with 5 solutions, if you look on the right-hand side. The first one was the board members didn't have the proper bylaws or the documentation, the procedures for how to stop destructive leadership behavior. The second one is they didn't have training. Just because you're a board member doesn't mean you know how to be a board member, right? Frankly, just because you're a leader doesn't mean you know how to be a leader. I'm working with an organization in Rogers right now where this organization has been around for decades, and yet so many people have retired. All of the leaders have been there for 12 to 18 months. They don't know how to lead their teams. So we need continued training. A lot of organizations are having me come in under the guise of continuing education. So you can have me come into your organization for continuing education to teach people about leadership aspects, positive and negative. But we need to have training for our board members, including their fiduciary duties, how to do conflict management, how to enforce their bylaws. They don't know how to do any of those things. The third one was one you could probably guess. We need some sort of human resources presence, whether that's on site for the organization or something that they hire off site, but they need to have something that's going to help them with their documentation and any law things. But it's the fourth thing that surprised me the most. The board members said that they need to have alternate ways of communication. So if you've got a board and then the CEO is the destructive leader, and then there's a VP under that CEO, the VP doesn't have a way to get past the CEO up to the board to talk about the destructive behavior, right? So the board members are saying, let's have alternate ways to get to different members of the board that can be more helpful.
Whistleblower policy is critical.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. In some cases, it's trickier when the person that I was interviewing was a board member and the destructive leader was the chair of the board. Then what do you do, right? Yeah, so different ways of communication, different pathways. And then the last one is probably also obvious, but it's a little bit tricky too. There's so much trauma and fear going on around people with destructive leadership. I actually have a page on my website, a separate tab, that lists therapists. Because if you've been under the behavior of a destructive leader, you've probably got lots of fear that you need to deal with. You might have some self-confidence you should deal with, some imposter syndrome things. One of my friends actually works specifically with CEOs who have dealt with destructive leaders above them in various aspects. So the employees need to have some sort of assistance with that. Emotional, psychological, all of those things. Any questions on any of that? Yeah.
Sure. So my question is around the level of experience of the board members. Did you see any difference in terms of how they dealt with that destructiveness, on the board? If you had a newer board or a board that's more seasoned, maybe over 10 years, do you see any difference in your research?
Yeah, great question. Carolyn on Zoom, he asked, what differences did I see between the board members for how they dealt with destructive leaders based on their own longevity with the board? Can I say that? There was an interesting mix of new board members and old board members, almost half and half of male and female, half and half where the destructive leader was either male or female, but 100% they didn't know what to do. These board members let the behavior continue because they didn't know what to do. So for the most part, if you're a destructive leader and a board member attempts to intervene, that destructive leader is going to quit. They're going to leave. Or they're going to make things really, really hard for the person who tried to confront them. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Sort of. So longevity of the board did not play a part in whether or not they knew how to deal with a destructive leader. Another question?
Yes.
Do you find when you work with a corporation, like you mentioned, the one in Rogers, do destructive leaders ever get an awakening as to what is going on and change their ways?
Oh, goodness. Good question. In comparison with that, I'm working with another big nonprofit in downtown Minneapolis where the vice president got together with me, and another vice president of this nonprofit is the destructive leader. And then I'm not going to say genders or anything, just in case. And she's like, "What are we going to do about?" Oh no, I just did. What are we going to do about this destructive leader? And I said, "Invite me to come, and I'll speak to a group of people and have that destructive leader in the group, and maybe they will see some of their behaviors in what I describe." Studies show they probably won't. There's usually too much narcissism involved in a destructive leader. However, they possibly could. But if they don't, then you do have to do the more one-on-one intervention type of steps. Yep. Yes.
Would it be useful to distinguish between a difficult person to work with and a destructive leader? And does that change the approach that you have to take?
Yeah. His question is it useful to identify a difficult leader versus a destructive leader? It's subjective. When I was doing my research, they wouldn't use the word difficult to displace destructive. They would often use the word toxic. Those two terms seem to be the same. I had a vice president, why am I speaking to all these vice presidents? For a big organization in St. Paul who said he would never have me come speak there because he starts out his day looking at glass ceiling. Which one is it? Does anybody know? What one? No, the one where it shows the reputation of the organization. It's still Glassdoor? I've never looked at it, yeah. He goes in there to see if any of the employees have been complaining about his organization. That's how he starts his day. So he said, if I had you come speak, people would post that they had a destructive leader expert come and talk to us, and that would hurt our reputation. He said, if you could soften it up, maybe that would help. And I thought about that for a few days, and then I thought, well, how do you soften up depression or suicide or cancer or all these other things that are really traumatic? You can't. This is destructive leadership. It's been around since 1938, and this is the term it's got to be. Yeah. Yes.
In your estimation, because you probably are the best judge for answering this question, if 100% of the total number of leaders, what would you say percentage of destructive leaders from your just judgment?
Oh dear.
Whether it's for profit, whether it's politics, whether it's non-profit and whatever. 30% of them, 5%, 10%? How much would be the percentage of destructive leaders?
Usually I don't get a question that I can't answer. I have no idea. Here's what I do know. We have far too many destructive leaders in the United States, in the world. Far too many. My goal when I got my doctorate, because I'm an IT geek, I thought that I would just go on and become a CIO somewhere or a CTO, lead a group of database managers for a nonprofit. And then I had this professor who said, David, nobody is talking about destructive leaders. You should get out and talk about it. It's fascinating, isn't it? And the reason that I'm doing this is because I'm tired of hearing those stories of people going to work afraid and driving home in tears. It just shouldn't happen. So we need to get this phrase, destructive leadership, kind of a household phrase and get more people to talk about this. Bring it out in the open. Yeah.
I was going to ask you if turnover ratio was a way of the indication if the leadership was destructive. And once I came up with that question, I said, well, no, because some industries naturally have a higher turnover ratio.
Yeah.
So how would you use turnover ratio, like you indicated, figure out if it's a leadership problem or if it's the way the industry's organized?
Yep, great question. How do you prove that the turnover ratio was the result of a destructive leader? Is that a good way to say your question? The number one reason people leave an organization is because of the manager. Change in management is the number one reason. But that doesn't mean that the person left because of the change in management. So there needs to be, this is another one of those procedures documents that's missing. There needs to be some sort of outgoing interview to determine why did this person leave. And then it should be up to HR or whoever to maintain a list of those things and see if a name comes up and if that name is repetitive or, does that help?
Well, yeah, but it almost puts HR in a unique position of being the overlooker of the organization should the CEO go or not.
Well, and hopefully HR isn't keeping that within themselves. Hopefully HR is showing that to other leaders within that department or division. So you're right, it shouldn't be their job to maintain those lists. But somebody in the organization, someone in the division or the department needs to know, are any of my people leaving because of this person? Yeah. All right, that's everything. Come and talk to me if you have more questions.
Thank you, David, so much for talking. I'm hoping that you can stick around a little bit longer if people have other questions. It was a very interesting topic, and we appreciate it. With that, we are adjourned.